Let's see. I'm just going to test real quick because I've had bad luck with this sort of thing. Let's see. All right. I'm just going to test real quick because I can hear myself. All right, good. Sorry about that. I'm still kind of new to the whole live streaming thing. Now, I'm not expecting anyone to really pop up because I don't have a great guest like World of Conan or, well, he's been, I think, one of the only guests I've managed to get on, and he was great. But today, it's just me. Possibly Dan later will join me. But I really wanted to discuss how, well, Tolkien, how he's had such an effect on us, and kind of go over his life a little, starting with his birth, which was on January 3rd, 1892. Now, the 1890s, to understand the world he was born into, one must understand kind of Britain at the time. Because in a way, Tolkien's life would end up mirroring that of Britain in some ways, not all, but primarily England, his beloved England. But the thing about Tolkien was, when he was born, the British Empire was starting to wax. It had waned, well, it was starting to wane, I mean, and it had reached its climax at some point in the 19th century before he was born. And the thing is, in previous ages, Britain had had a great rival in, say, France. But La France had become kind of a partner in empire to Britain. And this partnership was to, how do I put it, was to serve as a bit of a, how do I put it? It would end up being something that fundamentally changed the nature of the game, so to speak, the game of empire, I mean. And the trouble is that as the 19th century had progressed, the empire had started to wear down, had started to, I'm just zooming in for a picture I'm about to share, had kind of, things had changed. And the thing about Tolkien was that he had a great love for England. Now, he didn't really care about the rest of the empire, but he was born in South Africa, and his parents, early on, when he was a child, took him back to England. And his dad died when I think he was 4, so around 1896. Now, as the empire was winding down, it had run into a bit of a depression. And the 1890s was not a good time financially for a lot of people. And in some ways, from what I had read up and heard, it may have actually been worse than the Great Depression of the 1920s. So you had, in effect, an era where happiness was in short supply. And, oh, hello, Rosie Gamgee. Glad to see you here. And as I was saying, Tolkien was born on January the 3rd, 1892, in South Africa, and his family made the journey back to England shortly thereafter. And the empire had run into financial problems by the 1890s, so that the empire was beginning to wane. And add to that, you had the wildly successful Bismarck over in Germany, or I should say Prussia, who had completely changed European politics. And Britain had then proceeded to muck up their European policies by kind of sabotaging their partner in empire, La France. And they made up with France, but things were not entirely the same afterwards. And the empire was falling apart in some ways. Now, they needed to tie themselves up with Yeah, I said January 2nd. Tisk, tisk. Yeah, that was my mistake. January 3rd was actually when he was born. Sorry about that. 1892. And the thing with Tolkien was when he was 12, his mother died, and he was taken in by a kindly priest who proceeded to be his legal guardian for the rest of his minority. And the thing with Tolkien's minority is that it was, well, I think it had a lot of influence over him because let's bear in mind his mother had converted to Roman Catholicism and he was raised by a Roman Catholic priest. She was obviously religious, so was his surrogate father, so that you actually had this religious fervor that remained with him for the rest of his life. Add to that the early tragedy of the loss of his mother, and this did have indelible mark. And in one of his later letters, he mentions that he remembers his mother very well and that she was a source of joy and strength to him. And what's interesting is that apparently he had he had okay, how do I put it? There are similarities between Tolkien's relationship with his mother and that of Howard. Now, Robert E. Howard had the difference was Howard wanted to commit suicide in the 1920s. He had very dark thoughts and he was not doing too well emotionally. But the only thing that kept him going was his sense of duty and honor to his mom, who was very sick. And Tolkien felt a great deal of honor and duty to his own mother. Now, there were differences in personality between Mrs. Tolkien, or Mama Tolkien, I'll call her, to differentiate her from Edith, and Mama Howard. And the differences can be seen also in the difference in temperament and attitude the two had. Tolkien was obviously much healthier mentally than poor Howard. And the other factor is that Howard was to, kill himself, sadly, and was starting to move away from fantasy, which I do consider a bit of a tragedy. And Tolkien never quite moved away from mythology. What I do wonder is that if his mother had lived longer, maybe he would have ended up as depressed and semi-suicidal as his American counterpart. I just kind of wonder. Yeah, you're getting the names correct while I'm kind of slipping up on my mind is not focused on the names. Thank you, Rosie. Tolkien, though, from what I understand, met the love of his life, Edith, when he was 16, according to a few biographies. I'm not sure about some of that, but I do know that she was 19. She was 3 years older than him. And his legal guardian, Father Morgan, rejected his suit, did not approve of it, and basically told him no until he reached his majority. What's interesting is that we kind of think of people as reaching their majority around 18. And in England, going back to Richard II, the majority was 21. Because Richard II, the first part of adulthood was reached at 16 years old for him. But then he did not gain full power of his kingship till he was 21. So there's a bit of a parallel there, I think. Although the difference is Richard II was a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, and Tolkien was anything but. And having read a lot of Tolkien's early letters pre-World War, pre his participation in World War I, a few of the letters, I almost got the impression he was trying to show off for Edith. He was trying to impress her, and he was obviously very smitten with her. But the TCBS was also foremost in his mind. In particular, that particular letter I've read, and that I found very, very difficult to read, was the fifth one when Geoffrey Smith dies. This death was, in particular, devastating. So two of his best friends died in World War I. Tolkien was obviously not doing great at that time. But it's also around that time he started writing his first stories of the Legendarium. And I know a lot of people have a soft spot for these early editions of the Legendarium, and that it was around this time that he also found the first Tale of Eärendil, then started writing a Legendarium around it. But some of the early drafts are not as good as the later ones. I'm just going to be honest. So I know that's going to get me a lot of reprimands, a lot of people going, how dare you question the value of those early drafts? But I found that you can see that he's just kind of, how do I put it? He's struggling as though in the dark. Like, it's better quality reading than a lot of authors today, but considering, for example, some of the rough drafts of some of his contemporaries, it's not great. But on the other hand, you can see that he does have a talent and a natural knack. Honestly, I preferred his epic poem, The Lay of Lathian, to some of his early drafts. The Lay of Lathian, from the word go, is really good. But then as the 1920s were to later progress, he gets good. Wow. And those drafts are really good. But yeah, that's often the case, Rosie. He becomes a better writer as he gets older. Yeah. Okay, I'm glad to see that you at least agree with me. Yeah, the thing with Tolkien was, as he got older, he grew in wisdom and talent and skill. I like to think that where Robert E. Howard had a raw talent, a raw gift, Tolkien had it, but he needed to refine it. Where Howard was just naturally great at prose and literature and action and fantasy and mythology, Tolkien Howard was good at all these things, but had less talent at poetry, I found. I love his poems, but they're rough compared to Tolkien. Tolkien had a natural gift that he automatically had with poetry, so that he had to refine his prose. He had to refine and grow as a philologist before he can, become the mastercraft writer who was to be the definitive writer of the 20th century. So you kind of have Howard, who could have learned early on from the poetry of Tolkien, and Tolkien could have stood to learn early on from the prose of Howard. But in turn, Tolkien vastly outstrips Howard in some ways in prose writing with The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, I think. And as to Howard, now I know a lot of his fans are going to complain about me attacking his poetry, but I just find it very strange that Howard, these days, people are really smack talking his prose and pushing forward his poetry, which his poetry is middling at times. I like a lot of it, but let's not pretend he's a great poet. He's not Tolkien. Howard did not have that knack for epic poetry that Tolkien shows in The Lay of Lathian. Like The Lay of Lathian, I'm reading it again right now, and I'm loving it, and I'm kind of copying it down so I can annotate it, because I can't stand to annotate actual books. So I'm copying some of it down in a notebook, and I'm just annotating and just devouring it. It's just such great poetry. You don't see poetry like that today. And whereas what's strange, I find, is that Tolkien is sometimes disrespected in some circles. And on YouTube, I've seen some videos recently where people are complaining about his poetry, but praising Howard's poetry, but then criticize Tolkien, but then criticize Howard's prose, and then praise, Tolkien surpassed Howard in time, but it's just so strange to see people going on and on about Howard's poetry, but then attacking Tolkien's poetry when it's actually the reverse. That's true. But anyways, where Howard was to die at 30 years old, having written an incredible amount of literature with incredible quality, Tolkien, thank heavens, outlived the age of 30 and reached, I think, his 80s or something. I think around his 80s, and was to write so much about, like so much material, so that I guess we could compare in literature. Now that I think about it, Howard was Alexander the Great, and Tolkien was Julius Caesar, I think. And I really, because Caesar blossomed later in life, and far more than early in life, with the first half of Caesar's life just being there to lay down the groundwork for his later glory, and surpassing in some ways of Alex, while in turn, Alex just shone vividly and brightly, if briefly so. So, yeah, okay, the Elvish poetry, I guess, is not that great, but I don't know. I have a soft spot for the Quendi language, because I just find it sounds very musical and lyrical, and reminds me of Gaelic in some ways. And anything that reminds me of Gaelic, I just fall in love with. I love Tolkien's languages, and I wish I had his gift for philology. Now, I know I should not be turning this into a comparison stream, but I'm trying to. I just find it very difficult not to compare Tolkien and Howard, because I find them both very fascinating figures, fascinating personalities. And as I'm watching more and more documentaries on both and reading up about both far more, I'm finding that the parallels are more similar than one would think, and they're both individually such giants. Yeah, sounds great if you can understand it, which I can't. Yeah, I can't. When I read the untranslated Elvish, I have to immediately look up the Quendi stuff and then string it together, Rosie, so you're not alone. You have to. It's tricky, but it makes reading it very slow, but it's enjoyable. Maybe I should do some videos on that, and on the Lay of Lathian. I really love the Lay of Lathian. It's a passion of mine, because there are so few modern epic poets and poetry that I like. The last great epic poem we had in English was The Fairy Queen, and in French, I think, was one about Jeanne d'Arc. And then before that, you pretty much had the Aeneid, and then we need more epic poetry. Now, as to Tolkien, his fifth letter is probably the most shocking letter I've ever read. Now, I've recently read Howard's first letter, where he begins to hint that he wants to commit suicide, and I did not find it I did find it a little shocking and horrifying and depressing. But the letter Tolkien wrote to Christopher, his other best mate, about, I think it was Christopher or Jeffrey, and the fifth letter is so shocking, so all-consuming in its grief, in its sorrow, in just the prostrate mourning and sorrow, that it defies description, defies expectation. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Jeffrey. I actually have the letter right here. Let me look it up. I should look it up. I've got so many little things, little marks and whatnot. Yeah, it's Jeffrey Smith. And yeah, I thought it was Christopher Wiseman, but it's Jeffrey Smith. And I'm not going to read it in its entirety again. And there's a bit of irony, I was told, in that he says, I could write a huge letter, but I have lots of jobs on, when he already wrote a very long letter. But it is impossible not to feel his grief. And it is just such a sorrowful, heartbreaking letter. And the next letter, because I almost prefer to read the letters than to read biographies when it comes to Tolkien and Howard, because I find that you kind of get to know them more through the letters than through a biography. And they just, like, you look at the next letter after the bit about the fifth letter. The next time we find him, he's pretty much a professor, and he's working part-time at, I think, well, where was it? Well, I think Leeds. Yeah, Leeds. And then he ends up looking to Oxford, and he would remain at Oxford for decades, which, it's pretty funny that the next major incident, though, is not really depicted in the letter, but we know for a fact, is that well, outside the birth of his children, those are pretty big events. I mean, come on, doesn't get much bigger than him having his kids. And just, let me actually look up Tolkien's birth. Oh yeah, it'd be 1924. I was pretty sure it was 1924, November 21st. Yeah, and looking up one other thing. And the next major incident was 1926 when Tolkien met Lewis, which, it's a shame we didn't get a movie about their shared history. I thought there was one in the making, but it got canceled, I think. And the two men were basically to be almost a couple for the next couple of decades. And it is very interesting how the two really kind of instigated each other's literary achievements, quest, and journey. And it was, I don't know, like, reading about the two, it was fascinating seeing how the two, when they first met, were both in some ways damaged men from the First World War, with Lewis having made a promise to take care of one of his best friend's mom. And in turn, the other guy made a similar promise to Lewis, but then the other guy died, and Lewis was to go on to take care of said mother, and was to also take care of Warnie Lewis, who was a profoundly impressive biographer of Louis XIV, an incredible writer in his own right. So you've got Lewis, who was to... Sorry, my throat was getting dry. I had to drink. And the thing with Lewis was that he was an atheist who had lost his faith, I think, in the First World War. I'm pretty sure he lost his faith a bit before, but he had no faith. He was a profoundly lonely, heartbroken man, I think. And then, it was like soulmates. You have Tolkien and Lewis, who became the sort of best friends that Lovecraft and Howard became, with Tolkien keen to rescue Lewis from this abyss, in a way, I think. And it's just sad that Edith never took to Lewis like her husband did, and that it kind of became an overcrowded marriage in a way. Although from 1926 to 1931, Tolkien worked on converting Lewis to the Roman Catholic faith and encouraged Lewis forward with his own pursuits. And Lewis encouraged Tolkien in his pursuits of the legendarium. Now, I'm just quickly going over the life and times of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And hopefully, my hope is that a few more people might join us, and Dan may come back inside because he has to mow the lawn. And that, I'm just checking out the Discord. And anyways, and that Chris has a live stream going on soon. Oh, it's all right. I'm pretty excited about that too. I had thought to invite him onto this one, but he's too big to join such a small one. Chris is such a joy. Philosopher Games. If anyone is watching this after this live stream, do subscribe to his channel. It's just such a good channel. Probably one of the top 10 best Tolkien channels. Now, as to Lewis and Tolkien, it's funny that Tolkien encouraged Lewis to write his sci-fi story. Tolkien tried to write a sci-fi story, but then ended up just writing a plain fantasy story. So there, yeah, Chris can talk for hours. Yes. Oh man, sorry, I'm very fond of Philosopher Games. He's one of my favorite YouTubers. Anyways, I'm hopefully not going to be talking for as long as him, but because this is just a stream about honoring Tolkien. And I know people might get annoyed that I'm not getting into Lord of the Rings right now or the Rings of Power, and I'm just glossing over. But I'm just enjoying this far more than I would the any kind of discussion of modern stuff and whatnot. And as to your question about what sci-fi story did Tolkien try to write, well, it was actually about a father and a son who are reincarnating backwards towards the time of Atlantis. And it essentially is, I guess you could say, kind of the Akalabeth. And it's basically the story of the downfall of Numenor. And this downfall story would have, I believe, included a steampunk Numenor of sorts, from what I remember. And it was a very interesting read. Now, I didn't find it as awesome as the actual Akalabeth, but honestly, I love the Akalabeth. So while it's not as, and I know I'm going to come off as a hater here, it's not as well written as the finalized copy of the Akalabeth. But this reincarnating backwards story was still an interesting idea. Maybe it's just that I love weird tales and Pulp Fiction like that, and this kind of reminds me of it. But it is so fascinating how Tolkien came across that idea, and then with this idea of a steampunk Numenor. Like a steampunk Numenor fascinates me almost more than anything else. But I don't think it fits in the Legendarium. But I would have loved it had Tolkien kind of, like with the Roverandom, stepped out of the Legendarium for 5 minutes and wrote a steampunk story. I would have loved it. And I guess that's kind of why I like the Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood story, is because it feels to me like a Tolkien steampunk kind of story. No, he never published his steampunk story or his reincarnating backward story. He would have, but then he lost interest, I think, and became very disappointed with his story. He just felt that it wasn't the best story he could write, and he kind of talked it over with Lewis, I think. I read somewhere that he talked it over with him, and the two reached the conclusion that what later would be like the next draft of the Akalabeth was better. And Lewis said, you know what, forget our bet about sci-fi, just focus on this mythology of yours, because that's way cooler. I don't think he used the term cool, but he said this is way more splendid, I guess, since they're Victorian men. But you get the idea. He just said that's far more interesting. Go down the route of mythology. Forget about steampunk. Forget about reincarnating backwards. Forget about sci-fi. Focus on you. I'll publish my sci-fi story. And it's around the time that they were working on this bet that at the same time that this was going on, Tolkien had published The Hobbit, which earned him a bit of money, let's be honest. And now, Britain had not quite fallen into the Great Depression as badly, I think, as America or Germany had. Because, wow, you read about the Weimar Republic, just the level of inflation they were in is just way worse than America, way worse. And the Weimar Republic's level of depression is just so tragic. And now I've been listening to some financial channels that are predicting that we may head down that road in a few months, at least for those of us in the West. And it's just, I honestly pray we don't. And that's just an aside. And but at the same time, um, yeah, C.S. Lewis. Yes, I guess you could say that. Yo, this story about Atlantis is legit way cooler than your steampunk stuff, bro. Yeah, that'd probably be the Americanized speech today. Um, I could actually see someone today saying that. Um, Especially some of my friends from Texas or I think North Carolina, in South Carolina. I got a lot of friends from the south of the United States, and they're just the most charming, funny people on the planet, and they talk like that. They talk like that, and maybe it's the fact that most of them are of African descent, but they all talk like that. Yo, this story is legit way cooler. So focus on that, and they're just such lovable scamps. They're always teasing and whatnot like that, but they're always honest. So yeah, Lewis was that kind of bro, I guess you could say. And the thing with Tolkien is interesting is that the Depression hit, and I guess in Britain it wasn't as bad. I'm just assuming because I don't know how Britain fared in the Depression. But whenever I read up about Tolkien, he does not seem to have been as hard hit as others. Now, he was never a particularly wealthy man hitherto, the Hobbit. So, but he had stability. Well, he had enough financial stability to have what, 5 kids, and to then and to pursue his little hobbies, to go out drinking on a probably tri-weekly basis, and just indulge in historical uh, book readings, fiction readings, and whatnot with his friends. Because I know Warney would read excerpts from his progress on the Louis XIV book that he was writing. You had Lewis reading whatever it was that he was writing. You had Tolkien with his Legendarium, and just some of the greatest poets and artists of Britain at the time, or I should say England, just going to the pub, reading together their work. And oh man, I can't. It would have probably been utopia to be in that pub there at the time, and to be listening to the greatest men in the 20th century, just reading their works together. Oh man, the Inklings. They're the dream of every great author today who loves English literature. And these, like, it might be weird, but I always kind of, whenever I see read these biographies or something, I always imagine in my mind just the dark, if slightly lit pub where you just have these guys at the back just reciting their poetry, their literature, and laughing and whatnot. Kind of what always comes to my mind is kind of the first scene when the dwarves come to Bag End. For some reason, I always have the impression that that scene of the dwarves singing and cheering and eating a great feast and drinking merrily and singing these bleak songs, but also talking like brothers and friends with each other and thanking one another, and Bilbo for being their host. I always end up kind of thinking of that scene and of the Inklings. And I think that there must have been some unconscious thing there that pulled from the Inklings and the TCBS and just, brought to life in The Hobbit. Or maybe it's just that I love The Hobbit so much because I read it at 11 years old, and just, oh man, The Hobbit. There's such a story. Such a story. I just can't stop loving it enough in Lord of the Rings. But what's interesting is that Tolkien, that scene, at least in my mind, was created in the pub, and you had the Oh, so I'm competing with philosopher games. Oh, that's okay. I'll keep going as long as I can, and then I'm probably going to jump over to him because, well, I love him as well. I would love to actually discuss the Lay of Lathian with him. Maybe I should message him later and see if we can maybe make that a thing. Sorry, I'm thinking aloud now. Thinking about the Inklings always makes me think of poetry and of some of the art clubs I had in university. Because, well, anyways, but it's, and I only, now I'm just going to quickly comment on the fact that Edith apparently didn't always like these little late night interludes with the Lewises and the other professors because, well, she was at home and she kind of wanted John's company to herself. And sometimes I think he stayed out too late and he'd come home a zombie and would kind of be out of it the next day. And, you know, that doesn't make for great company sometimes because, well, you know, they're a married couple who love each other, but he's spending more time at times with the Lewis brothers. But on the other hand, I'm also going to mention that I'm only making references to Warney because I've read some of his writing and I actually like Warney Lewis, and I find him a very tragic figure. Just real quick as an aside. But as for Tolkien, it's interesting how after The Hobbit was published, thanks to I think one of his former students, who basically acted like a literary agent for him, which is incredible. And trust me, as a writer myself, it's really hard to find yourself a literary agent. It's just you have to know someone, and it could take you years to realize who knows someone or who actually has connections or has some sort of ability for literary agenthood. I guess I don't know the term here, but it's really difficult. So Tolkien was probably not really confident there, and he probably would have turned to Lewis, but you know, former student proves to be his Saddam Almul Saint-Ian, his dame in shining armor. I guess because I know it's knight in shining armor with men, but with women it's a dame because I know he was a lady. So yeah. So he goes on. It's sent published with Stanley Unwin, and it's a little funny that they had such success. They said we want a Hobbit sequel. Tolkien threw at them several stories of the Legendarium, actually, and they turned it down. I know he threw the Lay of Lathian at them, and they didn't want that. I think he threw the Lay of Lathian. I know he threw a couple of other stories. They rejected them. He threw the Silmarillion at them in its entirety. And yeah, they said Hobbit sequel, Hobbit sequel, Hobbit sequel. That didn't work out. So, of course, Tolkien got started on The Lord of the Rings, what would become The Lord of the Rings. And actually, his first ideas were quite good. Maybe I'm just partial to Bilbo, in that Bilbo is my second favorite Hobbit after Sam. Well, maybe third favorite after Sam and Mary. But the trouble is that I know a lot of people that I talked to, and I showed the first few rough drafts of Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo says, "All right, I'm going away and I'm going to get married." And I know a lot of people who don't like that idea. I actually think it's a fascinating idea. It's not what Tolkien finally settled upon, but it's such a fascinating idea. If we had kind of gotten a Hobbit sequel where Bilbo stops being a bachelor but goes on this great Hobbit style adventure and gets himself a lady, it would have probably felt like Shrek or something. Yeah, okay, Trotter was bad. No, I meant the pre-Frodo drafts, Rosie. Like the first few were good. Those about Bilbo. But then he got into Bilbo having a son, and that didn't work out. Those were bad ideas. as soon as he decided to drop Bilbo as the main character, I found the drafts stopped being all that great because of, well, the idea of Bilbo's son. Then Bilbo's son became his nephew, Frodo, and Frodo was an infinitely better idea. And for some reason, it worked better with Bilbo being a surrogate dad than a biological dad. Well, an adoptive father rather than a biological one. Because then you were able to kind of stretch out Bilbo as a father figure so that he almost seemed like a father figure to Merry, Pippin, and Sam on top of Frodo. So you were able to kind of widen the scope of fatherhood away from just one. Yeah, the number of Hobbit confusion with Odo was, that was a problem too. Okay, yeah, I'm just saying that you look at his early drafts in his early career, outside the Turin to Rambar stuff, most of the draft and some of the Eorendil stuff, most of the early drafts in the 1910s and early 1920s were not the best. They were quite good, but not the best work he ever produced. The Bilbo Lord of the Rings drafts were pretty good. I don't know. I just have a soft spot for them. But then he got to that Trotter stuff, and that was just, oh my gosh. Yeah, Frodo, Merry, Pippin, and Sam took forever to form. Yeah. I suspect that had we gotten the original Bilbo's, well, not the original, because had we gotten, I think it's the Bungo sequel, all 4 characters would have probably been one character, and that would have been horrid. That would have been terrible. But thankfully, he sliced a character arc into 4, and we got so much more content, so much more lore, so many more countries, so much more stuff. And thankfully, we got a lot more. And you got Trotter. Oh gosh, Trotter lasted too long. Too many drafts with him. He was a terrible idea. Thankfully, he evolved into Aragorn, son of Arathorn, son of... I'm not even going to do that. Yeah, Bungo was bad. Bad idea. But I think that we can see through these drafts Tolkien kind of working out the ideas within his legendarium, and that he's working through things like not every how do I put it? I'm just clicking away at something for a new image because that's going to be direly needed. It's how do I put it? I'm just struggling because it's how do I put it? Okay. This is the thing is Bungo and Trotter and all this stuff. Well, Trotter came after in the Frodo period. He needed to do this because he's working through something. He's processing, he's undoing, he's redoing, and whatnot. He's going over various drafts, and the thing about the history of Middle-earth with all these drafts is what's fascinating to read about it is that you're seeing the formation of the story and the formation of like Gondolin, Lord of the Rings, of Children of Húrin, of Akalabeth, and whatnot. You're seeing the formation of everything. And the formation is as fascinating as the finalized product. And yeah, he did know what was good and what was bad. Now, that said, from what some of his letters show, he did need some advice from the likes of Edith, Lewis, and Christopher. Now, Edith helped copy down some of the early stories, and I'm pretty sure he had read some of the stories to her. She did kind of salvage, I think it was the early Eorendil story from 1916 or 1917. And he needed, I think he needed people to listen to him as he read it chapter by chapter or went over it with them. And Christopher was, I would argue, the best editor in history because he he was able to push his father in the correct directions, even when he was stationed elsewhere in Africa and was receiving some stories. I think one of the letters mentions that Tolkien was wanted to go over some of the stories with him by telegram and whatnot, and it's and by letter, it and when he got back, Christopher would go over some of the stories with him, and the two would kind of discuss, and basically Christopher joined the Inklings and would read the stories in place of his father, and would work through the process and help with editing. Lewis was, of course, the first proofreader and editor to every story of the Legendarium. I'm just moving something around on the desk, and like, yes, I'll acknowledge Tolkien was probably the best self-editor almost in the 20th century, or almost ever. Although Howard was also a really good one. I might actually argue Howard might be a little better at self-editing, because Howard had very few editors, and the Weird Tales publishing magazine editors and writers, well, not writers, owners and whatnot, were not always very polite to him. They didn't much like him. They were robbing him. And Howard he liked to have his little notes, but he also self-edited when he realized something was bad. Tolkien did have people to bounce off of to an extent, and a lot more than Howard. Although Tolkien was certainly a great self-editor. And oh, well, I'm just wrong. Okay. But Tolkien self-edited perfectly. And like, oh man. And yeah, he was clearly going over the process. I think him dropping Bilbo, though, for Lord of the Rings was not out an external influence. It was more him going, no, this doesn't work. Then him dropping Bungo was, I think, him going, nope. And Trotter, I don't know. I would have given anything to be a fly on the wall and to have heard these conversations. And then you've got, of course, around, I think, 1950, you have Narnia that's published, and Tolkien was not entirely impressed and found it too allegorical. I think that was the first divide between the two men. And in turn, Tolkien, when he published Lord of the Rings, Lewis basically said, best thing ever, best piece of literature you'll ever see. And yeah, but the thing with Tolkien, though, is that what's interesting is I think the Hobbit money had kind of started to run out, or it had been stored aside, probably kind of stretched out over the course of several years, because, well, men back then knew how to stretch a buck far more than a lot of people know how to today. I'm not criticizing men and women today. I'm just saying back then, you lived for the Weimar Republic or the Great Depression of the Western world. When I say the Western world, I mean like the Anglosphere. You're going to learn how to stretch a dollar. And it's just, and then he's, okay, okay. Well, I think the first Narnia book was incredible. I'm not keen on the rest of the series, though. But the movies I absolutely love. I love the movies. Yes, Lewis was certainly great at theology. He writes public speaker. Lewis was just a giant intellectually, much like Tolkien. But if you compare that first Narnia book to Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, there's no comparison. You can't. It does not. Okay, I hate saying this. Like, I don't know how to word it differently, but it doesn't quite measure up to the grandness of Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, or even The Hobbit to an extent. But Lewis was certainly a good author. I don't know. I really love that first Narnia book. And I will always have a soft spot in my heart for the Narnia movies, which I still think are fantasy movies par excellence, and actually improved on a lot of the stories, and yet stuck true to the themes and the theology and whatnot and the ideas. But anyways, Tolkien, I know Lord of the Rings turned him into a household name, and the rest of his career after that was spent on trying to get around the Rubik's Cube that was the Silmarillion and trying to get it to work. He couldn't quite figure it out. And he was also starting to get into the metaphysics of his world. Now, late in the 19th century and early in the 20th century, a lot of writers and academics were starting to discuss metaphysics, which is the study of, I think, trying to put into mathematical and scientific terms spiritual energies and what makes certain people distinctive from others. For example, you might have English metaphysics, Scottish metaphysics, French metaphysics, Texan metaphysics. Now, with Texas, I know Howard was interested in that topic. And yeah, Tolkien's metaphysics are very, very complex. And to kind of simplify, the idea is I think that when it comes to the elves, for example, and the humans and the dwarves, they all have a Theia, I think it is, a spiritual energy all their own that belongs to them as a people. Now, you have to break down the metaphysics probably of the Sindar, of the Noldor, and whatnot into separate pieces. And that each of them have their own spiritual energy. Each of them have their own. This is a bit of a butchering, but one thing I did appreciate about Tales of Symphonia, the video game, is that it approached metaphysics in a very fascinating way, but in a simplistic way. I guess you could say with Tales of Symphonia, it'd be like mana or something, and that each person has their own kind of energy that's distinctive to them. George Lucas is also very, very fascinated with metaphysics, and his idea of the Force is basically metaphysics. And each individual has their own midichlorian count, which is basically like their spiritual DNA. And I think a lot of people did not fully understand what Lucas was doing. He was harkening back to these old metaphysical ideas, because you got to bear in mind, Lucas did study that stuff. Him and Joseph Campbell were fascinated by it, and they did study it. And as to the elves, their bodies eventually fade away, whereas human bodies decay as the spirit. Now, with elves, I believe when the body begins to fade away, the spirit also shrinks and begins to fade and become little more than a cipher of sorts. It's unable to really interact with the world unless they've crossed over, I think, to Mandos's halls. Whereas with humans, the spirit kind of the body becomes unable to contain the spirit, I think, and it goes over to a separate set of halls within Mandos's halls. And I think that's how it works. And if I've made a mistake, I expect people are going to point it out to me and tell me, Joe, you're wrong, and explain it better. Now, I'm fascinated by the topic, but I've not quite mastered it to the extent that, say, the Red Book or Girl Next Gondor have. They are just geniuses and understand metaphysics to such a degree that's fascinating. And hello and welcome, Spectre. My Friday's going quite well. Okay, I'm glad you're here. Well, I'll understand if you have to go soon. You're always such a joy. It was a pleasure to see you the other day at the Conan stream, which we're currently in talks for another one. But anyways, yeah. To answer your question, Rosie, yes, Finrod would have been reincarnated already in Valinor. Now, it's mentioned, I think, in the appendixes or the Silmarillion, I forget where, but when she crosses back over to Aman, to Valinor, Galadriel meets with her father, Finarfin, and her brothers, Finrod, Felagund, and Orodreth, I believe. And she is reunited with them, and, well, you have this rosy family picture of sorts, pun intended, and you got this kind of family reunion, which I think it's supposed to be, in a way, a happily ever after for Galadriel, whom no longer, I think, is fading as she once was, because, well, she's in Valinor, where folks don't fade. At least that's my reading of the text. I like to look at it. Now, in Rings of Power, Galadriel sets off on a revenge quest for Finrod. And as you pointed out, Rosie, and the thing with Galadriel is that let's see if this will. All right. Oh shoot, I'm really struggling. All right, let's see. All right, I'm back. Can you guys hear me still? I think I almost lost the connection there. I'm just gonna click into YouTube just to see if I'm still live, because, well, it'd be a pain if I wasn't. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I'm live. So, all right. Now, where was I? Now, the thing with the metaphysics, well, I kind of find that the revenge of thing with Galadriel doesn't kind of fit with where her character should go. I do understand that they're wanting to give her a good arc, which, okay, that's fair, but it is like, fair enough. You don't want her to already be, I don't want to say perfect, but at the end of her arc, like, say in Lord of the Rings, because this predates Lord of the Rings, and I'm just going to check to see if I'm still kind of live. Lord of the Rings. Okay, yeah, I am. Good. I just have to double check. I'm not entirely good with tech, so bear with me. But as to Tolkien, this question of metaphysics really began to haunt him. Now, where Howard had at one point in his career become fascinated with the metaphysics of Texas, kind of regarding Texans as a breed apart from the rest of America. In some ways, Howard was the father of the Texans movement that's currently sweeping a chunk of the southern US. And the thing is, Howard, though, eventually lost interest in that. He did kind of dabble a little in some of his stories in the metaphysics of his world, but I don't know. I think he dropped it. I don't know. I haven't read as much of his private notes or anything. I don't know if you can buy them. Maybe Spectre knows. I don't. But Tolkien, you look at Morgoth's Ring in Nature of Middle-earth, my two first loves, they are chock full of metaphysics notes and whatnot. And these issues on metaphysics were to trouble Tolkien for a good chunk of his life. What's also interesting is that in the 50s, Tolkien tried writing his own radio drama script for Lord of the Rings. And, well, I think it was rejected. But it would have been interesting. Clearly, Tolkien was interested in the issue of adaptation. He had no illusions about it. But he didn't trust others to manage his work as well as he could, I think. And yet, he did sell a lot of the rights for money because he saw it as just a source of easy cash. And I get that. What's also interesting about his latter years was that he moved away from his beloved Oxford in order to appease and please Edith, who really wanted to be elsewhere. And it just speaks to the fondness and the passion Tolkien still had for her. And it's just, like, he had been in love with her since he was a teenager, and they had been married since I think he was 21, and they had, they were married till she died, I think in 71, and just, for almost the entirety of his life, he was married to her. So that's life goals right there. But what's interesting is that, in marked contrast to, say, Howard's romance, which fell apart, Tolkien's never did. And Tolkien, I remember reading a letter where he says, you have to choose your wife at all times over anyone else. And that the kind of compromises he made for her is something not many people seem to comment on these days. I've heard people attack him for not compromising enough, but you look at his move away from Oxford, he didn't want that, but she did, so he just did it. He set aside what he wanted for her. And Tolkien was a passionate believer in, I guess, compromise. And I remember him writing in his letter to Michael regarding, the birds and the bees, where he mentions that real love comes from living together with your lady, and, and that you basically have to put up with each other long enough to truly know that you're the one for each other. And this philosophy, I think he tried to pass down to Christopher, who had one marriage. It failed. Christopher moved on to Bailly, who was, I have to proudly mention, French-Canadian, although she's from Winnipeg. And she moved to England and became John Ronald Reuel's Tolkien's secretary, then graduated to being his daughter-in-law. As some of us Canadians like to say, she graduated from secretary to daughter-in-law. And she made her own contributions to the Legendarium by taking down Tolkien's notes, copying stuff, and trying to keep stuff from getting lost because he was cluttered. But now, he had already had Simon Tolkien as his grandson by then, but I know that Christopher was to provide him with more grandchildren. Priscilla provided him with quite a few, because his last letter is addressed to Priscilla and requests her to bring, I think, his grandchildren with, her children, and that he really wants to see Priscilla again. But after his death, Tolkien, in a way, I think, assumed a larger-than-life figure. He became a giant. And I do hope... Now, one phrase that's been passed down through the Scottish medieval history departments is that the tragedy of the Bruce is that the legend has devoured the man, hollowed him out, and left none of the memory of the medievalness and the true reality of what Robert the Bruce went through during the Scottish Wars of Independence and what he actually did. And that legends often devour the figure until they become a caricature of what they truly were. And people forget what they were really like. Now, I do think Robert the Bruce was a larger-than-life figure by his very nature, but si you regarde that, just what the legend did to him and what his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, his son later did it. Yeah. And with Tolkien, I wonder if maybe the legend has devoured the man, so that the man himself was kind of partially forgotten. The legend was kind of has kind of devoured him. Like you look at this entire Rings of Power controversy. Everybody began saying, Tolkien would agree with me. No, Tolkien would say this, or Tolkien would think this. When you need only look to Christopher and the interviews with him, and when he discusses his dad, and even discusses his own views, and you read the letters, Tolkien's alive in those interviews and in the letters. We know for a fact what he would say and think, and just people just twisting it around. I don't know. There's something wrong with that, and I wonder if maybe this is simply how it works, and that it is human nature to aggrandize such figures, but to ultimately forget the human being. And in some ways, Tolkien, the best way to know him is by reading the letters and ascribing to him, like, oh, my politics, I think this, therefore he would have thought that. I don't think that's quite right. That, in a way, that's not as the Vagabondo comic book from Japan, which is about Musashi, puts it, when our perception of other human beings is at times skewed, and what we project onto them is but a shadow self of them. What it fits more ourselves, so that our view of Tolkien, for example, is more our view of ourselves. And I wonder if there's truth in that, and that in a way the legacy is being twisted and perverted by a lot of people. I'm not making commentaries or aspersions against individual people or attacking anyone. I'm just saying that all people have basically been taking him out of context and just ignoring his letters and saying, no, he would have thought this. When Tolkien made it very clear what he thought, what kind of person he was. And yet people just, for some reason, forget it. And you look at Christopher's interviews, he's always making it very, very clear that, or I should say was, because Christopher's passed. I just tend to think of him as still alive. Christopher makes it very clear what he thought his dad would have said or thought or did. And Christopher was a very vibrant individual himself, which I think he had the exact same personality in some ways as Tolkien. Maybe that's just my perception. But I just think when I read the letters and I listen to Christopher, I just think that these two are two peas in a pod, thick as thieves. And that Tolkien and even Edith, to an extent, had two great legacies. Yes, the Legendarium, but also Christopher. And I don't know, I just have a great deal of love for Christopher Tolkien for publishing the Silmarillion and all the Lost Tales and Unfinished Tales and all the other works. And you look at Tolkien's last few years, they were spent with his grandkids, his kids, and basically almost in retirement, it seems, as he was trying to figure out the Silmarillion, the metaphysics, and with no hint, I think, in the 60s of the great sorrows that had ravaged his life in the 1910s, or the great fears he had for Christopher's safety in the 1940s when Christopher went off to war. And because you read some of the letters, he's very panicked and frantic with worry and consternation for Christopher's fate. And you could see the closeness between father and son. And it's just, it's a tragedy that we lost Christopher when we did a few years ago. Now the whole world was blessed with the fact that Christopher lived as long as he did, into his 90s, I believe. But yeah, he did live to his 90s, and it's just, if only he had lived 1 or 2 years more, I think. But the works published in 75, 77, I believe, 81, and 86, and throughout the next couple of decades is just phenomenal. I mean, you look at Children of Húrin, Baron and Luthien, and of course, The Fall of Gondolin. They're all monumental works, incomparable with anything that's been published before or ever since. And now earlier, Rosie Ganji, you commented that you love the Aeneid, and the Aeneid is admittedly my favorite of the ancient epic poems. I love the Iliad. I've read parts of it in French. I've read the Odyssey, parts of it in French, but all of it in English. I've read the Aeneid, and I would love to get my hands on a French copy because I have an English copy. But the Aeneid, oh, and I've also read a good chunk. Well, I've read the entirety of the Fairy Queen. I say chunk, but there's only a small chunk of the poem that was finished because Spencer never completed it. But if only Tolkien had decided to finish the Lay of Leithian, that would have been great. But I'll definitely have to do an entire podcast on the Lay of Leithian, and maybe even do a discussion of it line by line or something, or a bit like what I'm doing at the Power Ranger Corner, where with a shot-for-shot analysis of the Power Ranger 1995 movie. Maybe I'll do that for the Lay of Leithian. It would certainly be something that would be, I don't know, it could be fun. But I'd have to get through the first episode of the Angmar Wars video, which I'm currently working through because I've been promising that for a while and the fans deserve it. But anyways, the bulk of this posthumous publication, though, at least in my opinion, is well, there was an attempt to overshadow it, I find, with adaptations. Now, I'm going to start hating a little because I'm not a big fan of adaptations, but I want to preface that by saying I love the BBC radio drama. I'm listening to it right now. I promise I will do a review of it, a review video at some point, probably in November. And it is just such a great listen. I would also love to see if I can get the other Tolkien tubers to do a full radio drama of our own like that, but I don't know. Well, we're basically doing that over on Voice of Geekdom, but anyways, that's just, sorry for meandering. This is what happens when I don't have a streaming partner. I often meander all over and go all over and get distracted. I guess I shared that in common with the professor who would, from what I remember of one documentary, got distracted by this tree or that tree. My thoughts wander all over randomly. Now that said, I'm not trying to ramble. I'm just noting I have that problem. But after the BBC 1981 radio drama, it was the Peter Jackson movies. Now, with the Peter Jackson movies, the War of the Last Alliance is shown briefly. Gil-galad's hardly even seen, and that's a problem, at least in my opinion. And the actor looks splendid. Like, he looks perfect. But Galadriel's actress, I should say, sorry. Kate Blanchett does a perfect job with the narration. They really got to get her to narrate more stuff. It's a shame because she's got the female equivalent in terms of voice of Morgan Freeman. They really should have gotten her to voice more over and narrate more stuff, or get her to do maybe an audiobook reading of The Hobbit or something. That would be beautiful. But anyways, or maybe the Akalabeth. She would do a killer Akalabeth narration. But the trouble with the Peter Jackson movies, I find, is that there's a lot of miscasting and there's a lot of decisions that I don't agree with that were made, but they made bank. And weirdly, it almost feels like the movies have tried to overtake the books. And as though, for some reason, I've noticed people saying Peter Jackson's A Lord of the Rings, which is a very peculiar thought because there's only Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. What Jackson is doing is just adapting what came before. Oh, and I just remember the Bakshi depiction. I forgot about that adaptation. Bakshi had made his animated series, I think, in the mid 70s, but shows how much attention I pay to these adaptations. But the weird thing about the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings thing is technically Peter Jackson is just adapting someone else's work, but now maybe it's just me being a jealous fanatical fan of sorts of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, but I kind of feel annoyed when I hear Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. And it's like, no, he didn't make it. And yet it seems like a lot of people who've never read the book attribute the story to Peter Jackson, not to Tolkien. I don't know if it's just me, just imagining that. And it's just so peculiar. And it's really come out more and more in the past few months. And that is so peculiar. I just can't quite understand why that's happened. But as to the next real thing, I think, now real quick, Narnia came out in the throughout the 2000s as well. And weirdly, they got dunked on as just being Lord of the Rings light, as though there's anything to do with Lord of the Rings with the Narnia universe. But for some reason, people felt that Andrew Adamson had taken inspiration from the Lord of the Rings movies. I think it's just, there's the sense that this is a worthy competition to the Lord of the Rings movies. And there's a resentment there. But that said, Andrew Adamson was an accomplished fantasy director by the time he did the first Narnia movie. So that's a major factor, because let's bear in mind, he made the first two Shrek movies. So he knew his fantasy by then. Yes, Shrek is a spoof, but there is legitimate fairy stories and fantasy and mythology in there. So that's to be considered, I think. And you look over, and I think it was 2003 or 2006 that Children of Hurin was finally formally published as a novel. And then after that, we started to get all the other great epics of the Legendarium. And now we have Rings of Power. So it's just so peculiar, though, that you've got Tolkien, who's become this gargantuan figure, but for some reason, Peter Jackson overtowers him as a figure. And I can't quite. Sorry, I'm not trying to constantly go back there to that train of thought. It's just, I don't get it. Like, it's just so weird. And I'm sure I'm going to probably end up losing some people. I might lose some subs because I'm basically, I guess, bad mouthing, as some might put it, Peter Jackson. But hey, he made his movies, he made millions. Obviously, there's mass appeal. But I can't quite understand why they're attributed to him rather than Tolkien to an extent. Yes, I know he did it, the cinematography, the directing, and whatnot. He should get all the credit for that. But the story is not his. And that's what I mean. Like, it's so peculiar. But then you've got the new Rings of Power, where I wonder who they're going to attribute that to. because it seems like people are attributing it more to Jeff Bezos, but he's just forking over the money. He's not he's not overseeing the project himself. So it's the two showrunners who would be the most powerful presences on the set. So in that regard, it's very peculiar. Well, them and Simon Tolkien. Simon Tolkien, I know, has a lot of influence over this project. So, yeah. Whereas Christopher, he did not much care for adaptations, from what I remember. He hated the Jackson movies, did not find them lore accurate or accurate in any way to the spirit of Tolkien. And add to that the fact that the studio did rob the Tolkien family of their percentage of the shares made of the money made from the movies. That's also a problem. So you have this fractious relationship between WB and the Tolkien estate, and now you've got this seemingly much closer knit relationship between the Tolkien family and Amazon. So hopefully Amazon won't try to cheat the Tolkien estate, but overall, sadly, we lost, I think in 2019 or 2020, Christopher, and that's such a tragedy. At least there's still Bailly Tolkien, and of course Adam, or Adam, as we say in français. And yeah, I think I've kind of discussed Tolkien's legacy into the pavement because, well, yeah, as well as his life almost into the pavement, going over his friendly competition with Lewis, going over the great bonds he forged with the Lewis brothers and with the rest of the Inklings, going back to the TCBS, to his fascination with metaphysics, his struggle with the Silmarillion Rubik's Cube, or puzzle, I should say, his relationship with Edith, which honestly I think is probably the most beautiful love story of the 20th century, because it was not like this, it's not this crazy love affair like what Marilyn Monroe had or what the Kennedys had or something, but it lasted across how many decades? So yeah, I think that was a much more touching, beautiful bond than, well, than a lot of other relationships. It probably was the most beautiful love story of the 20th century because it lasted. It lasted. And you read the letter where Tolkien comments on her death, and he says that he is barren, and she has left him behind, and now the whole story has gone crooked. So that, his grief is heart-wrenching. And it's just, that's another one of his letters, which I only read part of it because, well, I'm doing the podcast over on Instagram where I read it for the first time, and I'm recording those. And it's just such a heart-wrenching letter. You really feel for poor John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Poor guy. But you look at like his life from the 1890s, when he's born in a Great Depression. He's thrust into a life of difficulty, of being a soldier. Then there's the Great Depression, which he lives through, which he didn't actually struggle too much financially in comparison to others through. Runs into financial success, but then has to see his son sent off to war and probably suffering from shell shock as well. And then then years later, there's kind of the slow, quiet separation from Lewis, and then the death of Edith. Well, the death of Lewis, the death of Warnie, then the death of Edith. And each of these losses must have been quite the shock and quite the loss for poor old John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Now, I'm not saying he's a figure to be regarded with nothing but pity, but I do think some sympathy and compassion is due, and I find you can kind of understand him if you read history through an emotional lens, I guess. And of course, you have after his death, his posthumous life, I guess you could say, where the legend starts to devour the man. And I wonder if the same thing has happened to Christopher, because he's become an icon for editors and has become the greatest son in history. And I don't really want I do hope Christopher gets all the credit he deserves, but I don't want the legend to devour him. That would be, I don't know if that's what John and Edith and Christopher would want. But anyways, I think this stream has gone on long enough. The chat has slowed. I've got 4 people here now. And I think that's about it. I'll just check the Discord where I just spoke to some of the others. Okay. Yeah, no one's going to be jumping in. So I'm going to leave it there and hope everyone has a great day. And, well, I'll say bless the memory of the great professor, because look at all the mythology he imparted to us and all the gifts he gave to humanity as a whole. And, well, yeah. So don't forget to, if you enjoyed this stream, smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were, I don't know, Eru Iluvatar casting down Numenor. And I do hope everyone remembers to share this stream with anyone you think might enjoy it. And once again, I bid you good day and the very best.